Good morning. If you were here Thursday, you heard John announce that I would be teaching today, and many of y'all are still here anyway, so thank you for that. There's a lot of reasons for that. One, John is going to be needing a break here and there. Two, we feel it's just better to have a plurality of elders in the pulpit when possible, when God lays something on our heart, gives us something to say. You've heard from John, you've heard from David, you'll be hearing from Fred today. You've got me. And let me just begin with a confession, and that is, in preparation for this, I pulled from a lot of people. I pulled from John, pulled from Dave, Fred, Jason, and others, and it still created a real sense of anxiety, which is very ironic when you're preaching on Sabbath rest. And John sent me this meme about sermon prep. I don't know if you can see that. But I really did. I mean, he asked me if I wanted to teach, and I said, yeah, because the Sabbath, I've got this outline in my head for 15 years, and this is just going to be beautiful. But then as things have evolved over time, it goes from Monday to where we're at now. There's this little bitty stick figure on the right, and that's where I found myself the last about 10 days. And then I think God just kind of said to me, you know, you've got some stick figure drawings from your children, and they're precious to me. And so I did not go to seminary, and I didn't do a lot of things. So this is a stick figure sermon, but I hope it will be precious to you, what God has to say to us about Sabbath rest. So y'all pray for me, and let's open in prayer, and we'll hear. Father, I do offer up this stick figure sermon, and I pray that it would be representative of what it is you've put on my heart, not just in the last few years, but what I've seen in life about the importance of a Sabbath rest, of the Lord's Day, of this gift you have given us. And we thank you for this time before us and just this body that has gathered. And I pray, Father, that as we look into your word, that we will see it for just that you would be able to use this vessel to hear from your word about what it is to be said here this morning on the Sabbath, on the Lord's Day. And we'll ask it in your Son's name. Amen. Quite a while ago, Lynn and I were given the opportunity to go to Israel, and as those trips go, you kind of look at your schedule and you look at your checking account, and you say, yeah, I think we can do this. And so we booked a trip to Israel and took our kids. And as a lot of those tours go, your last day is spent in Jerusalem. And we found ourselves in a hotel in Jerusalem. And we woke up there on Saturday, and it's the Sabbath. And if you've ever been in Jerusalem on the Sabbath, it's a different vibe, it's a different feel. It's a little bit quieter, it's a little bit slower, and you can just kind of sense this is a different day. And we went down, had our breakfast in the lobby, got into the elevator to go back up to our room, and we got on with another young couple and their kids, and this little boy reached to push the elevator button, and his mom slapped his hand and said, Sabbath. And I just remember thinking, wow, I don't know what just happened here, but I'm not pushing any buttons. If Linda wants to try it, she sure can, or if one of my kids wants to push a button, I'm not pushing any buttons because I'm going to get slapped. And I asked about what just happened there, and the tour guide explained, well, it's the Sabbath, and you're not to work on the Sabbath, and the rabbis have decided that pushing a button constitutes work. And so they have programmed all the elevators in Jerusalem, probably other places, that on the Sabbath, they just go to each floor, the door opens up, and if somebody's there, they get on, they get off, and it just rinse, repeat, recycle. I mean, that elevator is just running constantly, and you don't push buttons on the Sabbath because that would constitute work. And I thought, that's kind of silly. But then it reminded me of when I was a little boy. We ended up at my grandparents' house in Florida, And they had a trailer that might have been 400 square feet. I might be generous on that. And they had a patch of grass that might have been 100 square feet. And the only thing they had there for entertainment for me and my three brothers was a croquet set. We played croquet. And we went to church on Sunday morning, and we came home, we had our lunch, and I went to get the croquet set out and was setting it up, and my grandfather, a holiness preacher, told me, "This is the Lord's Day. We do not play croquet on the Lord's Day." So, put the croquet set up. I just remember sitting on the porch of the trailer, looking at my little brother thinking, the Lord's Day, someday. And what do you do when you're a little boy and you can't even play croquet? That was not a lot of fun. So when I say the Sabbath, when I say the Lord's Day, what comes to mind for you? What do you think of? Is there anybody in here old enough to remember the blue laws? Yeah, we've got a couple. Mel, what were the blue laws? Day of rest. Day of rest. There were some things. Mm-hmm. A lot of things were closed, and then some places that were open, you were limited in what you could buy. For the younger set, how many of y'all are planning to go to Chick-fil-A for lunch today? You're not going to go. Why? It's the Lord's Day. They're closed. Yeah. So what I want to do today is kind of try to tie together the Lord's Day, the Sabbath, see some commonalities, see some principles that God has given us in that, and see what truths there are that we can learn from that. Obviously, the Sabbath is Jewish in nature. It's the last day of the week. It begins at sundown on Friday. The Lord's Day is the first day of the week, and we celebrate that. Why? Well, in 2 weeks, we're going to have Easter. We're going to celebrate Christ's resurrection. And so that's why Christians meet on the Lord's Day, Sunday, in contrast to the Sabbath, which was the seventh day. And we know those things. But why did God give us this? Why did God give us the Sabbath, the Lord's Day? Well, in Genesis chapter 1, if you want to turn there, you can, but you know it. I'm just going to skim it. We see separation. This is one you're familiar with. There's a separation of light from dark, water from land, day from night, man from beast. So you see a separation, you see a distinctness, and you also see a rhythm, do we not? You see that we're going to be working 6 days, we're going to take 1 day off. There's a rhythm here to this. So we're familiar with that. In Genesis chapter 2, if you'll turn the page, we're going to see in the first 3 verses, this theme continues. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed His work, which He had done. And He rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made. So, the first word that caught me on that is the word completed. And I studied this just a little bit. And in this text, in this context, it has the idea of completed. There is nothing left to do. Now think about that. Every molecule, every atom, every universe that God was going to create, He created. Now, have we rearranged some molecules, some atoms over time? Yeah, we have. But everything that God ever intended to put into the universe, He did it. And He wrapped it up on the sixth day. The next word is God rested. Now, a lot of things we learn through school, a lot of things we learn or pick up maybe even genetically, but there's some things I think that's just on-the-job training. A lot of the skills that we learn in our jobs, there's an example there that we need to look at, we need to follow. So we learn a lot of things from example. Did God need to rest? He did not need to rest. But He gave us an example that we should follow because we need rest. So God rested. The next verse, we see God blessed this day. And do you see that it is God's nature to bless? Do you see it as desire to bless? Is that our concept of God? That He desires to bless? That He desires, that is His nature? And then the last word here is God sanctified this day. Has the idea of consecration, to be set aside as holy. You add all this up, and this is what I call one of these moments that is a cause to pause. There are times when let's just stop for a minute. This is the pre-fall creation, and it's kind of anticlimactic to use the illustration, but I'm a car guy, and ever since I knew what a car was, you could tie one eye behind my back and I could spot a Rolls Royce from 100 yards. It's just something I knew when one was in the area. I'm a Rolls Royce guy, still am. Can you imagine a 2020 Rolls Royce just rolling off the assembly line and just immediately being put out on the road? No, we're going to stop for a minute. We're going to put it in the showroom, and we're just going to glory in this majestic machine. This is a moment here of creation when everything is completed, everything is perfect, and God says, we're going to stop for just a minute. This is a cause to pause. And so Jeremy helped me out with all of this stuff. I'm not a slide guy, but we had a picture of what the pre-fall looked like. Isn't that interesting? Could you just breathe that in just for a minute? And there's a lot of different artist renderings of what the pre-fall creation looked like, but that to me just chill. Isn't that nice? Could you just stop there for a minute? And could we worship? That's a beautiful picture. It's a beautiful thought. So that is the purpose of the Sabbath in this point, not the Sabbath, but just the seventh day. The Sabbath represented the perfection of creation. It was complete. It was blessed. It was sanctified. It was at rest. Isn't that a nice thought? Complete, blessed, sanctified, at rest. Yeah. Well, you know the story. The fall did occur. And God chose a man named Abraham. From Abraham came Israel. From Israel became a nation. From the nation, they ended up in Egypt. In Egypt, things didn't go too good. God came in and provided Moses. Moses took this group of people, and in chapter 14, we see God's deliverance through the Red Sea. He provided deliverance. In chapter 15, God provided water in the desert. In chapter 16, God provided manna. In chapter 16, God also provided quail. And then in Exodus chapter 16, God provides something else. Verse 29 through 30. See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you bread for 2 days on the sixth day. Remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. What did God give his people after food and water? He gave them the Sabbath. He gave them rest. Now, I'm a father, 3 kids. If I were in the wilderness and I saw God miraculously provide manna, miraculously provide quail, miraculously provide water, that's fascinating to me. But I have to pick up the manna. I have to knock down the quail. I have to cook the quail. I have to go get the water. There's some work still to be done there, even though this has been provided for miraculously. What am I thinking when I've been told on the seventh day I'm not to do anything? It creates a little bit of tension because I've got little people I've got to feed. I've got to feed myself, and there's a concern there. But what is God saying? He's saying, I've got this. I've got this. I will get you fed. Don't worry about that. A little bit of anxiety, but he's introducing the element of trust. Okay? Trust on a very elemental level. This is food. This is water. Are there going to be things in life later on that we're going to have to trust God for beyond food and beyond water? Yeah, but it begins here. Food and water, trust. And once that food and water has been received and is miraculously provided, what should that produce in us? That should produce in us thanksgiving, right? Have you ever been in a legal or a financial situation or anything, maybe a medical situation, and you've gone to talk to the experts and you've explained this dilemma, you have no solution, you don't know how you're going to get out of this deal, And they just kind of get a silly grin and they say, I got this. I got it. Don't worry about it. Well, what am I going to do? Well, you're not going to do anything. You can go home and take a nap if you want. But this problem, I've got this. I've got this. And that's kind of what God is saying here. I've got this. Food, water. Can we trust Him on that? Can we give thanks to Him on that? Turn over a couple of pages and you're going to end up in Exodus 20. This is the giving of the 10 Commandments. In verses 8 through 11 is the passage that was read by Fred. We see the Sabbath is commanded. So there's some observations here. The first one is, before we even get to that, following the command we're going to study and spend some time on, in verse 13, you're going to see 4 words. You shall not murder. That's a full command right there. In verse 14, you shall not commit adultery. 5 words. That's a full command right there. Verse 15, you shall not steal. 4 words. But when we go back up to verse 8 through 11, the passage read, we have 98 words, and it is the first positive command. In some translations it says, you shall remember this. In the New American Standard, we get remember. And the thought here, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. And there's another sermon that we could preach there on labor, not today. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. I was talking to a man one time who ran a restaurant, and he told the story of a customer who bought out the restaurant for the evening. And I said, I've never heard that term. What does that mean? And he said, well, he called me, asked what my income was for a typical Friday night, asked what my expenses were, what his profits were for the evening. And he said, well, that sounds great. I'm going to buy it out. And he just purchased that whole evening. I don't want anybody else in the restaurant other than me and my guest. I want the full kitchen staff. I need the wait staff. I don't want anybody else in the restaurant other than me and my guest. But that's an interesting concept. And God, in a very real sense, is taking this day and He's saying, I bought it out. This is my day. This is my day. So if God bought this day out, what are we to do with it? Well, in verse 8, the first word in my translation is remember. And when we remember something, what does that imply? If Linda tells me to remember to pick up on your way home, well, I think that means that I have to have a plan. It requires planning. And it also then, I have to in fact act on that. It requires action. Remember. I think another thing that can be noted here is, who is He telling to remember? He's telling the Israelites, who at one time were slaves. Did the slaves ever get a day off? I don't think so. If they did, it wasn't much of one. Remember that you were a slave and you've got a day off. I think another word, the next word is, we've talked about this in verse 9 through 10. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day is the Sabbath day to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. You or your son, your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the 7th day. So it is rest. Now we have some young parents here. How important is it to you that your child receive rest? Yeah. It's very important. Yeah. And just like a good parent, God provides rest for us, and He provides a time for us. My dad had a quote, and he said, I can do a year's worth of work in 11 months, but I can't do it in 12. What does he mean by that? What does that mean? Just that. If you don't take a break, things are not going to go well long term. There are periods of times where we need to rest. God, in a sense, is saying in this command, you can do a week's worth of work in 6 days, but not 7. Kind of a more modern term we would use for this term would be reboot. I know I was late coming to the game with a smartphone and finally yielded, got my little phone, and it just was not behaving at some point properly. And I shared this with my girls because they can always hand it back and it's fixed. Well, and it didn't get fixed, and they just said it needs to be rebooted. I said, well, now I'm about to boot this phone. I don't know. Tell me what reboot is. What is a reboot? Well, you turn it off. This is a machine. This is a computer. This is a phone. It does not need to be turned off. That's not going to solve anything. I mean, I know that much. And they said, no, you need to reboot it. How is rebooting, how is turning off a phone going to fix the phone? I don't know, Dad. That's what you need to do. Turned it off, turned it on. Guess what? It worked. Reboot. And let me just ask the question here. What kind of deity, what kind of God commands rest? Have you thought about that? What kind of deity, what kind of God commands it? Doesn't suggest it, but he commands it. I would say that is a deity, one, who knows his creation, and two, I would say he loves his creation. He knows I need that. He knows I need that. It's commanded. What a great God that he would command that. I think another part of this whole idea here is we need to recognize God's sovereignty. And sovereignty is a term we really don't like, and we as Americans, we left Europe because we didn't like the way kings were doing things. There's other countries and other cultures that understand a king and they understand sovereignty better than we do. But in a very real sense, God just exercises his sovereignty in the choices that he limits us to. In Genesis, he tells Adam, this tree, not that tree. He tells Abraham, this son, not that son. He tells Rebekah, this son, not that son, the younger, will rule over the older will serve the younger. In Numbers, he tells the Levites, you're the priests. In the next chapter, he tells the Kohathites, you're the road crew. You're going to pack it up. You're going to ship it. God exercises a sovereign choice. And so this God, does he have the right to order our schedule? Is that his right to do so? I believe it is. And so we need to learn how to order our schedules around his agenda, not the other way around. God bought this day. God bought this day. Now, we could stop right here, and I think we would be the better for it. We could break, we could pray, we could go home, take a nap, rest, remember, realize this is a blessed and sanctified day. And wouldn't that be great? We really would. I think we'd be the better for it. But Scripture continues, so will we. We go now from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and in Mark chapter 2, 23 through 28. This is a story you're familiar with. And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began making their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and he ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat, except the priest, and he also gave it to those who were with him. Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Is the Sabbath to be one more item, one more day that we just beat man up with? That is not the purpose of the Sabbath. You're not supposed to just get beat up by the world and its system for 6 days, only to have the seventh day beat you religiously. That's what Christ is saying here. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. We need the Sabbath. The next phrase, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, if you were a good Jew, if you were a good Pharisee, if you were a good Sadducee, and you heard a man say, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, what would your response be? Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? Yeah. In my business, we can go from being very slow to being very busy in a matter of a few phone calls with a storm. In 1 year, that happened. We had a storm, we got busy, and this particular year it worked out where I had a very good general manager, and he hired half a dozen guys, and he went one way, and I hired half a dozen guys and went another way. And we just got busy, and we went to it. And a couple of weeks later, we scheduled a lunch just to kind of play catch-up. And we were just going back and forth on how things were going, and there was one kid we hired that we both really were impressed with. And I asked, how's it going with this guy? Because I really was impressed with him, seemed to know what he was doing. And he just kind of laughed. And I said, what's so funny? He said, well, he says, I visited with him just the other day and asked him, how does he like his job? And he says, I like it. He says, I like working here. There's only one thing I really don't like. And he said, well, what's that? And he says, that Alan Chamberlain guy. I said, Alan? He says, yeah, I don't like him. Well, why? He says, well, he says, he just shows up, parks wherever he wants to park, comes in the office, does whatever he wants to do, leaves whenever he wants to leave, shows up on my job, starts getting pretty bossy. He said, he just acts like he owns the place. And he says, well, that might be a problem. And he says, well, why is that a problem? He says, well, that little squiggly on your check on Friday that you can't read? I said, yeah. He says, well, that says Alan Chamberlain. Yeah. When you own something, do you have the right to be boss of it? Yeah. That's what Christ is saying here. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. I own this. This is a different kind of man, isn't it? Yeah. Christ takes it up a notch. Same story, different passage, different. There's one more phrase I want to pick up in Matthew 12. This is a continuation of that story. I won't read the whole thing. We're going to focus on verses 5 and 6 of Matthew chapter 12. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests of the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. Something greater than the temple is here. Probably the oldest Sunday school joke of all time fits in right here. Teacher was talking to her kids. Little boys, little girls. What has four stubby little legs, is furry, bushy tail, gathers nuts for the winter, lives in trees? Not a hand goes up. She's surprised. So she calls on her star student, little Cindy. What has 4 little legs, bushy tail, furry, gathers nuts for the winter, lives in trees? Cindy shakes her head and says, I know the answer is Jesus, but it sounds a lot like a squirrel to me. Sometimes the answer is Jesus. So the question is, what is more important than the Sabbath? What is greater than the temple? What is more important than the Sabbath? And think about the audience again. The Sabbath, the temple. Christ is greater. Christ is greater. Sidebar, Romans 14. Let's turn there real quick. Jeff had asked the question Friday night about folks that take a legalistic view of the Lord's Day, and what do you do with that? Darrell was sharing with me that when he was a kid, he could not read the Sunday comics before church, but you could read them after church. If I'm going to my grandparents' house, I can play croquet on Saturday. I can't play it on Sunday. What do you do with this? In Romans chapter 14, we could spend a couple of weeks on this passage. and we're not going to do that. Just in big ideas here, this has to deal with principles of your conscience, the Christian conscience. What will your conscience allow you to do? And there's a couple of points we want to make here. One, Paul is kind of addressing two different camps, because even 2,000 years later, you see people divide into these camps. You have these people who no croquet, no comics, and then you have other people, I'm loading up the boat, I'm going to the lake, and phooey on meeting with y'all. It's, all days are alike, and I'm going to do what I want to do. And Paul addresses that on these non-revelatory issues, when Christ did not speak to boats in lakes on Sunday, and he did not say things about delivering babies and things like that. What do you do? Well, where's my verse? Let's focus on verses 5 and 6. This is Romans chapter 14, verse 5. One person regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God, and he who eats not for the Lord he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. A couple of phrases here we want to catch is for the Lord. This is between you and God. So my convictions might be different than somebody else's. I have two friends who will spend between 40 and 50 hours a week in an office behind a computer, and on Sunday, their biggest joy is to get on a lawnmower and make laps around their yard. And for me, that would be wrong, because I'll spend 40 or 50 hours a week outside in the sun, and doing manual labor, that's not my deal. I don't want to do that on a Sunday. Sunday's a different day for me. Is it wrong for them? It is not wrong for them. Their conscience has allowed them to do that. Would it be wrong for me? It would be wrong for me. My conscience would not allow that. So this is for the Lord. This is between you and God. The other thing is we need to give thanks to God. If there's something you're questioning whether it's right or wrong for you to do on the Lord's Day, you could ask yourself the question, can I give thanks to God for this? Is this an appropriate thing? Can I give thanks that I can spend 3 or 4 hours with my family in a boat on the lake? Can I give thanks? Is that my attitude about it? Then you may have your answer. I think another thing too that kind of needs to regulate all of that is love. We do need to be aware that there are other people that are watching, that are aware. We need to be careful with this. We need to be careful. We don't want to offend. And I know these are very broad answers to very broad questions, but we need to be aware that the things that we do on the Sabbath, they need to be for us and God. Are these things that draw us closer together? Are these things that help us in our communion and our worship with God? And I think we need to understand too, there are seasons of our life when the Lord's Day, the Sabbath day, gets a little sloppy. If you're going to be an intern, if you're going to be flying internationally, if there's some things in here, and I get that, and God allows for that, and it's going to be okay. There are circumstances that require that we find ourselves on the Lord's Day not being able to do just exactly this, and that's okay. Now, on the flip side of that, I would say we need to be careful and try to find that time, make up that time later on. And what do I mean by that? Well, the freedom that we have, why? Well, the demands of the law, they have been met by Christ. Amen? Yeah, they've been met. We don't need to worry about that. But the principles of the Sabbath, the principles of the Lord's Day, they're still in play. So for our pilots, for our physicians, for anybody else that finds themselves that has to be working on a Sunday, and I even said this to John 2 days ago, when are you going to take a day off? And that day you take off, will it begin with worship? I didn't say that to John. I don't have to tell John that. Maybe I'll say that to Greg. The day that you take off, it needs to begin with worship. It needs to have elements of rest. It needs to have elements of trust, of thanksgiving. All these things we've discussed here. So the principles of the Sabbath, let's be careful with those. Now, can life beat us up? Can life get sloppy and messy and just kick the stuffing out of us? Can it get hectic? It's called life. Absolutely. I know there was a season of time, I think it was almost exactly 10 years ago, when our entire family found us in a very hectic time. My littlest had just started high school, and she was in this university model school, and it was tough on her. It was tough on her mom. My middle one was a senior, and her track schedule had just annihilated everything she wanted to do. She did not even get to go on her senior trip, which she was really looking forward to. Track prohibited that. My oldest was in Oklahoma, and because of things at work and home, we didn't get up to see her as often as we had liked. She didn't get to come down as often as she had wanted. Work for me was just really, really bad, and Linda was just in the center of it all between my work and her kids and parents and everything, and it was just tough, tough, tough. And we saw a little window on the horizon where we could take a vacation, and we booked it. And we pushed all the way up until the very end, and we even bought insurance because the way our life was at the time, we didn't know that we were going to be able to, in fact, make that trip. But the way it worked out is we woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, drove to DFW. We were on a plane a little after 5. We flew to Seattle, and they shuttled us into this big warehouse, and I could see the cruise boat out there. And I don't remember driving to the airport. I don't remember unloading, loading bags. I don't remember the flight. I don't remember everything. I just remember kind of waking up in this big warehouse, and I'm in this fog, and I'm just now starting to wake up. It's probably about 11 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, okay, I'm in Seattle, and now I'm hungry, but I can't get on the boat yet. But I'm about to get on this boat. What are we going to do? And so I found a little desk thing with a guy with his little suit. And I went up to him, and I said, I've flown in from Dallas. I've not had breakfast, and I and my family are hungry. And he said, yes, sir, you'll be boarding in just about 30 minutes. And he says, on the Lido deck, which is on the 5th floor, you will find a very lovely buffet. And just help yourself. I think you'll enjoy it very much. And I heard come out of my mouth, I don't want the 5th floor. I don't want the Lido deck. I don't want a buffet. And I stared at him, and he stared back at me. Now, he's from Seattle, and I'm from Texas. Guess who won? He said, yes, sir, and he reaches down here. He got a little 3x5 card. He scribbled something on it and handed it to me. He said, here you go. I think you'll enjoy this. Thank you. Put it in there. And we boarded the ship, and we walked past the buffet, and we walked up into a very nice restaurant. You've seen these restaurants that are at the bow, just all glass and guys in their little uniforms. And to my right, I could see the hills of Seattle. To the left, the ocean that we were about to head out to. And I don't know if there were 10 people in that restaurant. It was my family, some wait staff, and some others way off in another corner. And somewhere after the shrimp appetizers and the lobster quesadillas, I remember looking at Linda, and she was looking at me, and we just sort of kind of started giggling. It was like that moment when you're a kid and you play tag. It's ollie, ollie, all set free. Do you remember that? That I'm home, I'm safe, and I've got my folks here. And this is really, really nice. We were at rest, and nobody could get us there. We'd made it. And God gives us the Sabbath. God gives us the Lord's Day because He knows life is going to beat you up. And you may not be able to go 11 months. You might can go 6 days. And it's a gift to us that He gives us. He knows it's a necessity, that we are finite creatures that live in a fallen world, and we need rest. And so it's a gift. It's a short break. It's a reprieve from life. We need rest. We need to remember. We need to trust. We need to give thanks. We need to recognize that this is a blessed and sanctified day. And in our last passage, we're going to look at a future rest. We're going to look at Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. The author of Hebrews has been talking about the superiority of Christ on every level. And in chapter 4 he says, "Therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed we have had good news preached to us, just as they also, but the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. For we who have believed entered that rest, just as he has said, As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundations of the world. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time, just as has been said before, Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. Verse 9, So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. The final two questions. If you are a believer in Christ, if you have placed your total trust, your faith in Christ and in his completed work, how will you spend this day? How should we spend this day? Does it help develop in us an attitude of trust? I think for me, a Sunday is a day, as I get these little thoughts of things that I worry about, of things that I'm concerned about, of problems that I have that I don't know what I'm going to do with, I try to just mentally say, you know what? That's going to be there Monday. Today. I'm going to trust that God's got this figured out. I've got this for today. There's going to be Thanksgiving. So much to be thankful for. So much to be thankful for. Do we accept it as the gift that it is? Second question, if you're not a believer, if you have not gotten to that point where you've placed total trust in Christ and in his finished work, Hebrews invites us, Christ himself invites us, enter in. Today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Will you enter? And that will lead us into communion.